Okay, well, thank you so much for the invitation to join your meetup today. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about this. So Maggie, a little bit about me. Here's a little bit more. I actually have a background in geography and a lot of mapping and stuff. So I tend to see things from a geographic perspective, which I bring into sort of mapping, and then layering on business and consulting on top of that. And in my work on climate change adaptation, I was really interested in decision making. So all of those things have come together, and I've worked in a variety of things. And right now, I'm really focused on helping organizations navigate the traverse to portfolio agility. It is a really, really exciting space, and I'm just jazzed to be working in it and working with LiveSpeed on this. So we're going to dive into that today. I need to advance my slides. Come on, there we go. So this is from the book that Maggie was talking about. The sort of traverses to portfolio agility. I really loved this concept, and that there are 3 traverses, to do. There's the team agility, portfolio agility, and strategic agility. I found that to be a really powerful metaphor, and we're going to talk about portfolio agility today. So just for people who are maybe new to portfolio management, just a quick sort of, discussion about what a portfolio is. I'm not talking about investment portfolios. A portfolio is really the sort of total collection of all the things that your organization is doing. Projects, programs, service teams, all the infrastructure required to make things happen. And it covers the full life cycle of those initiatives. So everything from like the idea through operations down to retirement. And portfolios can be at lots of different sizes. I've seen, like, the company that I worked for, our whole operation was one portfolio. I've also seen places where a portfolio is really small, and actually in one section they had to divide into 2 portfolios because half of their work just really didn't make sense to plan with the other half of their work. So portfolios are an interesting beast. And so what is portfolio management? And that's really the way we handle all of that complexity. So how you identify things, prioritize them, select, organize, and govern them. It's really everything. And I really have felt like, having been in the trenches of it, it's a form of 10-dimensional chess, which possibly will drive you crazy. And so I have, in all the time, have tried to make things visible to make sense of what's going on. So just a quick kind of, like, we're sort of just reaching into portfolio management for a second. We're kind of considering the portfolio Kanban. That's a way of structuring how you manage your portfolio. And you always want to be collecting ideas in the intake funnel. You've got like a high-level discovery, sort of where you take ideas and decide what's going to go into discovery so that you can then create business cases that you review and select. Those, then once you've decided what you want to do, you put them into the portfolio backlog, and then you pull from a portfolio backlog and your teams implement them. So it works very similarly to Agile at a team level, but you're really focused on portfolio level investments. And so each piece of work there is a chunk of work that is being done at the portfolio level. And all the way across the portfolio Kanban, there are critical decision opportunities that, if they're not done well, can have a negative impact on your portfolio. And if they're done well, can really drive value for the whole portfolio. So I'm really interested in exploring, how do those decisions get made, what works, what doesn't work, etc. So decision-making is really the key. And so I encourage everybody to always elevate your decision-making practices. So you want to look at, like, what inputs do we need to make good decisions? Like, be really concrete about the information you need or your group needs to make decisions at each stage. Helping people be really explicit about the decision criteria that they're using. Often people are making decisions from the gut because there's so many different pieces. And that can be really powerful, but it really helps to be able to sort of like get them out there so people can see actually what factors people are making decisions on. And then being really clear about the people. Often I find in organizations, particularly in my work in the public sector, some people are making decisions that they actually don't have the authority to make. And other people should be making the decision and they're not. And so often you have to go around and find the right people to make the decision and then help them realize what decisions they need to make. I'm going to look at a piece of decision making. How do you support great decision making? And I've got sort of 3 ideas I want to share here today. So one of them is the power of making things visible. We're very visual creatures, and making things visible helps people understand the problem. We do this naturally. We often on the back of an envelope draw things out. I've also been in conversations where like I'll move glasses around on a table to kind of just help people anchor and see the bigger picture and the relationships between things. Then it's really important to externalize the information. And this helps separate people from the problems. I've been in many situations where I was fighting with, for instance, my director of sales. And it was becoming personal, and it shouldn't have been, because we were actually trying to solve a really complicated set of problems. But because it was just him and I, it became personal. And so getting information out in a place where we can see it helps to realize that we're working on this problem. We're not fighting each other here. And that really leads me to the third idea, is that getting into this shoulder to shoulder stance. So there's a lot of psychology on this where often, and it depends on the situation, but often face to face, I mean, it's great for empathy and, like eye contact and that kind of stuff, but it can be quite aggressive. And so often turning sideways so that we together are looking at the problem over here can actually encourage a lot of collaboration. And I definitely learned that in the trenches, where we had a lot of strife around our portfolio management, and we eventually got it all up on the board. And so I was the director of product at the time, and people would come and like yell at me about the decision. We could go and stand at the board and say like, here's the problem. Like, let's look at the problem together and see how we can sort it out. And so that's a very powerful stance in collaboration. And one of the things that making things visible and getting the problem does is it naturally helps us create that shoulder to shoulder stance. Now, it's actually really powerful if you can do it in person. And that's where being able to stand in front of the whiteboard together and be like, that's the problem we're trying to solve. It's not me necessarily. Or you necessarily, but it takes a little bit more work, but you can do that in an online setting. It's more of a metaphorical kind of stance than a literal one, but really trying to think of how do we solve these problems is a critical piece of sort of like uncoupling the problem from the people. So I'm just going to walk through a couple of examples. I actually don't come from a military background, but I'm really interested in the use of these kind of tools in complicated decision-making situations. So this is what's called like a sand table. And, we have the pictures in our head of people standing around a map in a war room and moving bits and pieces. The human brain we are designed to sort of have understanding of the spatial relationships. And so the fact that this is being used for a long time, this technology has been around a long time, speaks to the power of it. So this is from 1939, where they're, doing an exercise on the sand table, because then it really gets things in people's heads while they go out. It's also in use today on aircraft carriers, and I really love this idea. I've built this in various places. So the aircraft, I don't know if anybody has experience on an aircraft carrier. I'm dying to get on one day, but the aircraft carrier deck is extremely fast-paced and dangerous place to be. And they don't move aircraft until they've run it on the Ouija board, which is like a model of the deck with all the planes on it. And so you can run scenarios, and it's a very dynamic environment. And once you've figured things out, you can then go move planes on the big deck, where a tiny mistake can cost a lot of money. And so I have in my work tried to build what I've called, well, I don't call it the Ouija board because there's negative connotations on Ouija, but I call it the flight deck board. And I've used that. I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. I've used that on multiple occasions to give people a sense of like, what's on the plate? How do I turn our work into some kind of visual map that allows people to do the kind of scenario planning that they do on the Ouija board? And then one last example I wanted to show is this comes from some of the work I was doing in my graduate work on climate change, was land use planning. And actually maps are quite hard to read. And so this is called participatory 3D modeling. And what they do is they'll go into villages and they'll actually get the whole village to build a 3D model out of cardboard, and then start marking it up. And there's a lot of really interesting practices around this kind of map making that I've used in my mural boards. So first of all, it's a very, there's no hierarchy because everybody can stand around the map together. You don't have the same kind of power dynamics as you have like with somebody up at the front of the room owning the screen or owning the map. Everybody can stand around it. And they also have some conventions where anybody can put anything on the map, but it can't stay there until we all agree what it is or what to do about it. And so I have definitely used that in my practice to kind of encourage people to build into the map, even when we don't know things, as a place for kind of getting, again, kind of externalizing all that information. So visual techniques really support our natural cognitive processing. We're really good pattern finders, and we have a good sense of relationships. And so being able to actually see those relationships is really key. It also helps us compress distracting detail because you need to abstract and then highlight the visual, the sort of the most valuable parts. And then it can really help literally broaden the problem surface, see beyond what our piece is. So some of the techniques that I use, drawing, I actually have very limited drawing ability. So I'm definitely the circles and boxes. Don't ask me to draw people or fancy things. Before the pandemic, I used to do a ton of whiteboard drawing, even my stick figures. It was just really powerful to get things up. And what I would also find is that I would start drawing, and people would bug me about that. And then halfway through the meeting, we would sort of turn, and all of a sudden the thing that I had drawn on the board, however sketchy, was actually useful as a way of pointing at it and things like that. And so it was just a practice that I developed, just drawing alongside the meeting so that we have a problem space to work on. Then the piece about gathering information, even when things are unclear. And so in mural, and I love mural so much, you can drop things on the board, and then I turn them sideways when I'm not sure about them. So that means I can go around, and if I overhear something over here and I hear about something over here, I could drop it on the board. So now we know about it, but it's sideways. We don't know, it's not for sure, or maybe it's not real, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a really powerful way of always be kind of building information into a board. And then another piece is being able to show the whole flow, or being able to like get people beyond their piece of the puzzle. And that's particularly important when you've got multiple groups all working together. They usually can only see their piece. And so if you can show their piece in a greater context, that's very powerful. And it does help build that kind of shoulder to shoulder, like we're all in this together. And then another two ideas here, that there's a lot of power in movement, which is something that, say, Mural or Miro does, any of the whiteboarding things does very well, because it's interesting to watch. If you move, for instance, in the portfolio example, if you move things into an order, people can get often pretty sweaty about that and have some pretty strong opinions. And you're like, oh, well, that's interesting. What if we put them in a different order? Who gets to decide the movement of it? And so I'll often kind of exaggerate the motion of that just so that people can kind of go like, oh, no, that's not the right one. Like, oh, and then you can be curious. Why does that not feel like the right one? What's missing there? Is there somebody in the room that we need to check with? Is there somebody not in the room that we need to check with? So being able to use movement is really powerful. And it also allows you to test ideas. Well, hearkening back to the Ouija board. What if we do it this way? What if we do it that way? What would our world look like if we did it this way? And then we're sort of 3 months down the line. Are we happy with that decision? Do we need to go back and undo it? So there's some really powerful things in the movement. And then often I use visuals like a map at the beginning of meetings just to kind of center people on like, where are we right now? What's our current reality? So that we all come into a meeting with a common understanding. So I'm going to let's look at some examples here. I'm going to move to Mural. So I'm going to just walk through a couple of examples here. So this comes from the portfolio class that I'll be running at the end of the month. This is an example that comes loosely from the work I did as in the director of product at a company that made software for tugboats. And so these were all the things that we were wrestling with. And so each card here represented a certain amount of work. And very simply, I have a little a legend here. So the product had 4 modules, and sometimes they operated separately, and sometimes they had linkages with each other. And so I just used really simple coding here to show kind of what the impacts were. I have a brief piece of information here and a size. And what's been really interesting about running this exercise, which is something that we 1000% wrestled with, was actually watching people come up with like a fairly decent solution in a relatively short amount of time with almost no background in it. It's really interesting what information people need for making decisions. But the power of this is really, I mean, I would love to go back and run it with my team, 10 years ago, is just being like, well, you can kind of go, okay, so we think that these ones here, and you're like, no, kick that back. No, I don't think that's right. Okay, so, well, what about if we move this one? These two are similar, these two, okay. And so you're sort of making decisions as you're going, and then you're kind of both looking at the screen if you're doing with a bunch of people. And so it's really interesting, the power of being able to see it and put things in order, move things around. So that's a very useful tool at the sort of like when you're trying to figure out what are we doing next. And the interesting thing about making these kind of decisions is that you can move them around almost daily until you've decided to start working, right? So you can come back to it and come back to it and come back to it. I remember once, so we were doing this in the before the pandemic, and we had to finally get it all up on whiteboards. And I remember getting this, I'll be generous and say furious phone call from my director of sales about the choices we were making. He was calling me from Chile. And so he was like very angry about what we were doing. And I said, I'll send you the picture. If you can figure out a better way around it, like, let's talk. And in the end, he was like, no, you're right. I don't see another way of doing it. And that was actually fantastic. And we finally had gotten ourselves into that kind of shoulder to shoulder stance where we were really working on a difficult problem, and it wasn't that we had to yell at each other. That was like really an interesting and powerful place to go. So that's looking at the sort of portfolio decisions there. Here's an example of what I've built. This is actually an almost true to life example, except I've changed some of the names. I've used the COPS thing there but very similar structure to something that I'm using with clients right now. This is a flight deck board. So this is trying to show you all the things that we've delivered so far. These are all dates. So this is a timeline across the top here. I'm using quarters. And so these are the different teams. They've delivered these pieces. I have the dates in here. So that shows us what we've done and how far we've come. And here's the platform team, for instance. They're sort of more the infrastructure team, and we can see all those pieces in here. And then this is where we can start scenario planning. You're like, one team can work on a thing. So you're like, well, we need to put this in here, or actually, does it make sense to put this in here? Can I move this to a different team, or does it require specialized knowledge? Like, we theoretically could do that, but actually for team 3 to skill up in this area, it just really doesn't make sense. So we're going to have to layer it. And we can be sad about that. Or we could say, you know what, it's actually so critical that we get this piece of the safety module done that we need to move it on to the next team. And we're just going to have to plan for those differences. And so you can kind of go back and forth and, you know, play around with the ordering of these things. And so we had the same thing down here for the platform team. They always had more work than they could do. And so we were like, well, if you want to do this, you have to do this. Okay, so let's move this out the way. That means you can't start this one until after that's done. Okay, so we could actually put safety 2 in here because now that makes sense because this is a blocker to that. And so just having this board here enables you to kind of do some of that on the fly scenario planning. And then you can kind of go, well, I think this is how we want to do it. And then you might learn something new and come back and be like, no, we've got to redo that. So I have found this. And so this is, I mean, it's almost a map, right? We're using time and space in there. And I'm trying to keep the visuals simple and yet easy to read. And that's always an interesting balance there. But again, trying to externalize it, make it visible so that we can collaborate on things. This is the same view in a portfolio Kanban. This is like a simplified portfolio Kanban, but it gives you each one of these light colored things or what's in the portfolio backlog. These colors here are what's in implementation, and these are the things that we've done. And so sometimes it can be useful to think about these things, and sometimes that's sometimes too much information, and you might just need to consider the portfolio backlog as it stands and then kind of worry about the operational details afterwards. And so being able to go back and forth there is interesting. I can show you a little example of that just over here. So I just want to say in the real Kanban board, we actually, each one of these cards has a little bit more information in it. So if you're in the high level discovery area, the little small card will look a little bit more like this. If you're in the portfolio backlog, the portfolio board has like estimated time, cost, and release. And then when it's in the done and delivered, it shows like what it actually cost and the time and when did we go into production. So that's that. And I'm happy for people to ask questions as we're kind of going here. I'm sort of like noodling around this board. I'm not sure I see the chat very easily.
There's a comment from Tom Gilb.
Yep. I'm listening carefully for some notion of top level values or objectives. Do you have a specific question there, Tom, that you're...
Yeah, how do I hope everything relates to the idea of how we achieve our top level objectives, but I may have missed the mention of them or the on the map.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of like, I'm down a little bit in the nitty gritty. I'm going to assume that you have some of those things figured out. And I'm sort of like, what are we doing at kind of 9 o'clock on a Monday morning to support decision making? Because I mean, I'm only looking at a tiny slice of it. There's a lot for sure. And so really, I'm just kind of looking at how can you support some of those like specific decision making moments. And so there's a question about how do you call out some of the dependencies? You can definitely link, you can use arrows to link. Excuse my pink arrow. I was doing something else and that's kind of, so you can do that. Muriel, you're being silly. So there's an interesting challenge where if you start using too many arrows, which is totally legitimate, you can end up with what we called in one project the noodle of nightmares. And then somebody was like, we should rename that. We'll call it the linguine of love. But it really was a spaghetti monster. And so there's if you were doing this in the group, everybody would know that you had to do this before you did this, because you lived in this world, right? So I wouldn't necessarily need to show that, but if you did need to show that, instead of showing an arrow, I might put a symbol on here to say that this is blocked until, like, I might put like see what, so you could do this to show that these two are tied together. So that would be a way of showing dependencies. It's very easy for visuals like this to get out of control. And so you have to really be, it's kind of like that Coco Chanel quote, like look in the mirror and always take one thing off, like one accessory off before you go out the door. You're always kind of revising this to make it readable by the people who are trying to do those things. And again, trying to understand how much information is in people's heads and doesn't need to be represented on here. But, just even adding this piece here might actually be great because you're like, oh, there's a dependency here. I need to go find that. I can't just assume that I can move this around. So that's a great question. So I want to just move over here. So this is a different example where we were actually kind of like right down in the nitty-gritty of making a decision here. This is nothing to do with that tugboat stuff. This is to do with a group that's trying to modernize applications in the natural resources industry. And so they needed to go to their executive steering committee with a set of recommendations about what we do next. And so we were using visuals to say, this is where we are today. And this is what's proposed. And the key pieces here is that right now we have 4 product teams and we're going to roll down to 3. We might spin up a 4th one, maybe, not too sure. We'd have to get extra funding, but for all intents and purposes, I'm not counting it as a thing. We also might gain a systems team, but we don't really know the details of that. It might be a pipe dream. So I'm leaving it here. Again, this is where I sort of turn things sideways, but I'm not going to consider it. And so we said, okay, so some of these things are going to be done and in maintenance mode. And this is what we think. For instance, like they wanted to do some work in the billing because revenue systems were really critical across the portfolio. This app here is a foundational system. And this one, there's a high risk of the system failing, but you have to do it in one shot. And so then they pushed these things back into the portfolio backlog. Then we looked at the sort of surface of the decision-making process. And we realized that there are all these different decision makers. In this case, they were all assistant deputy ministers. And that we were starting to ask questions. And so even drawing this was really powerful because we put names down, not their real names, and looked at like what information do they need to make decisions? How do they make decisions? What is the sort of quality of the decision making in this group? And how close or far are they on priorities? So is everybody sort of trying to optimize their own piece? Are there sort of specific affinity groups that we can kind of understand? Like these two have complementary business lines, and so they tend to sit together, but they're quite a ways apart from these two, and so we have a big gap here. Walking people through this was a really interesting process, and then we highlighted here that the associate deputy minister is actually the decision-making kind of tie person, except that what information will they be using? And so we realized that we might need to give them an opportunity to try this on their own. To see, and so we kind of laid this out here. We have like the decision criteria that we're trying to use, and then very clearly 3 spots because there's 3 teams here. And so this can be interesting as a practice for being able to help them make decisions. And it's been interesting to do it with multiple people on the team. Like, okay, so we say this one is here. Okay. And then this one is next. No, down here. Okay. And so what about that? Are we happy with that? No, we don't like that. Okay. So, it's just being able to move things around and do the kind of scenario planning is a really powerful tool. So if you can, and again, this is not necessarily complicated to do. It's just boxes in Mural, but it can have a really powerful effect. And on purpose, so what we had somebody trying to do here, the reason for these gray boxes is because we had somebody going, well, I need this, and I have to have this, and like we need this, and like we can't not do this. But we don't have that many teams, right? So we kind of have to force ourselves to pick the ones. And yes, Matt, definitely. In this case, for this particular sticky here that we're looking at, unfinished business, they had broken their legacy applications into specific workflows. So instead of saying, we were really hewing to the idea of the value increment. And so instead of saying we're going to modernize this application, we said we're going to look at this workflow. We're going to look at this workflow. So the process of modernizing an application, there was actually sometimes 3 to 5 value increments inside an application. So this is the second one. This is the third one of that particular application. And so you could define, like technical debt might be a huge piece here. In this case, we were specifically looking at like unfinished workflows. But, part of the thing you might be looking at is like, we're going to have to do a big piece of technical debt fixing before we can continue. That's got to go in here. And so you can kind of force it to sort of even just visually to kind of make people really think concretely. Katrina, so how does this allow for responding to change as you learn new things? One of the interesting things is that you can change this a lot. That's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about portfolio management is that you can keep ordering the portfolio backlog as often as you want. As you learn new things, you're like, oh gosh, no, this actually has got to go to the top. I'm going to move this down. Let's have another, and then, in a few weeks you have another meeting and you're like, oh man, we're really learning new things about this one. This one's actually we're going to miss a big opportunity if we don't do that. So, okay. And so you can keep ordering this. There's no harm in ordering the backlog until you move it into work. You still might have to pivot inside here, but ideally you can keep, this as flexible as possible so you're not stopping and starting here. If you're looking at this book, they recommend the approach of using value increments that are as small as you can kind of reasonably make them and deliver value so that you have the opportunity. You can see here in the maintenance, we actually broke it into 3 pieces so that we could have, and we didn't keep working on it. We put a piece of it down and then picked another piece of it up. And so that kind of keeps you in that, like, looking for agility at the portfolio level. So all these examples here have been about portfolio. I wanted to show you just a couple of more things about visualizations. Oh, sorry, it's this book, the PMO to VMO. There's a link up in the chat. It was the book that Maggie was mentioning. So here's a little thing that we did to help them understand. They had to go to the center to get additional funding. They were looking at what are this is sort of just probability stuff, but it was really interesting again to make it visible and into a landscape. So we said, okay, there's going to be a decision, there's going to be 3 outcomes, and what do those things mean? And so just even helping people like put a percentage, like, is this a 10% chance or a 5% chance or a 20% chance, was just getting the problem out and giving people something to look at as they think was really important. So that's just a small example. And I will take screenshots of these and we'll pop them in with the package. So you have these later. This is a different example, and I just wanted to show you a way of visualizing timelines. So this was a project I was doing. I was supporting the implementation of some legislation, nothing to do with software. And it was extremely busy and there were tons of groups involved and they had a very difficult set of activities that they had to get done and a ton of groups. And so we did a lot of like timeline work and again, trying to kind of turn it into a surface so you could see the problem. So one thing I really like to do is, and I used to do this when I was drawing on the whiteboard, I'd always draw a calendar 3 months out, just because we're going to need to look at it at some point. It's much easier now. You don't have to do that. You can just go to time and date and create a calendar. You literally go to time and date, options. You can go in here and say, I'd like a 4-month calendar starting in June, show and save. And I do not want it to look like that. I want it to look like this. And then I just screen capture this and I drop it in Mural. It's, and then you can mark it up. So I've got different colors on here. It's a really powerful tool to have in a board. And again, it kind of creates some of that landscape. I'll then use these things to block in like days off, or I'll put like, you know, that's somebody's holiday, for instance. So you can do a lot. So what we were doing here is we had, these are all days. This is a calendar, but it's going out sideways. And this was at the daily level because things were so crazy. And so we had to publish some statistics. We had to get a survey out the door, and there was all kinds of other complicated things going on. And so I was using this structure to just help people visualize. So for instance, I knew we had critical meetings with like our First Nations. And so I would put this here and then I would color this blue so that you could immediately see that that was a piece there that I had to worry about. And then we had probably some kind of minister's briefing, but we weren't really sure when, maybe here, not too sure when. So it kind of hung out in here. And then we knew we had to go live and publish some really critical statistics and that there would be media events and all those pieces. And we had the sort of like definition of done for what that looked like, because some people were really focused on the media events. Some people were focused on on these things here. We had to have it in not 5 languages, 15 languages. And there was some confusion around that. So we tried to get as much as we could out here so that people could have that in their head. This is a holiday. That was my convention for holidays. And then, so I just start layering these things in here. So we knew that we had to go to Deputy Minister's Council this day. So I make that yellow. And then we had to have our survey platform live this day here. And like, that's what these things meant to us. The platform is live. The draft questions were live. Is the waiting room going to be live? We're not too sure. And so just, you know, you keep layering these pieces in here. When do we have a minister's briefing? When do we have whatever? It was really, so this one actually goes here. And then for the go live, it was very important that we were all on the same page about what did this mean. And so we kind of, you know, literally mapped this out and said, okay, so all of this is going live in here. And here's the things that we don't know. Here's the things that we know. And then we think we have a meeting. We think we have a meeting here, but we're not too sure. And then we probably got to get these community grant applications out the door. So you start to kind of like build up. And then as soon as we had more information, we could turn these right side up and say, okay, so now we know that that's a thing that's happening. And okay, this has come in, this has got to happen here. And I mean, we probably had 7 different teams all looking at this board. Now, you could say it looks crazy, and you might be right. And so I would always want to be looking at like, how could I simplify things? But I also know that using color is very helpful. So it's always a kind of fine line of like, how do you show this? But this was something we came to at the beginning of every meeting. We were like, okay, what do we know? What do we not know? What's new? What's different? Are there some cards that we can turn right side up? Are there some cards that we need to chase down? Like we had in here, what was the distribution plan for the media kits? Like, we really need to know this. Who's chasing that down? So it was a great way of organizing the team and stopping people from possibly going crazy. Okay, I just want to end with a couple of last little slides here. So my kind of final thoughts is encouraging people to own the board conceptually. It's not my board, it's our board, but that there are some inherent power dynamics in managing the visuals. So who is holding the pen or the mouse is a really key question. And a lot of people feel scared. They're like, oh, I'm going to wreck it. And so you have to kind of remind them, like, no, you're not going to wreck it. It's okay. We want people to put things on the board, and then we will deal with them. And then having a curator. I did spend time going through and just making sure the board is up to date all the time. It's a really critical job. Otherwise, it just gets old too fast. And that you always want to be pruning, always be pruning, taking things out when you don't need them, simplifying when you can, because you really want to guard against information overload. Try to avoid the noodle of nightmares. Actually, what they did is they actually were so entertained by it at the end. They're like, that we survived that craziness because of the noodle of nightmares, but they actually were going to like put it on the wall and be like, that was an insane time. Let's never do that again. And then really being curious about your decision-making processes, like at the individual level. Some people like to deliberate quietly. Some people want to hash it out. That the hashing it out works for some people, not others. What does the group need? And then what does psychological safety look like at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, right? For some people, it can be spirited debate. That is great. And for other people, that is not at all feeling safe. And so really asking those questions explicitly is helpful. And then practicing, like practice the decision-making before the situation gets stressful, so that you have talked about it and you're like, let's try and build that shoulder-to-shoulder stance. Let's not get personal. Let's not take this personally. Anyway, that's just like a small sliver of, the overall decision making. There's a ton of information out there, but these, in terms of like my experience in the trenches, these ideas have been super helpful for me. One last sort of thought is that, my arrow has moved. To get to this breakthrough, this is from Jim Collins, to get to breakthrough, this arrow should be pointing here, confronting the brutal facts. It's such a powerful thing of getting people to kind of turn the lights on so that you can get to breakthrough. I can't say enough about how powerful this is. Just wish my arrow was in the right place. And the visual piece can be very helpful in terms of actually looking at what's reality. Okay.